Welcome to this evening's online event entitled The West Bank, Accelerating Annexation and Ethnic Cleansing. This event will be an online panel discussion delving in depth into the acceleration of Israeli annexation and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank that has widely gone under the radar, with the genocide simultaneously happening in Gaza. We want to draw attention to the recent invasion, mass arrests, Palestinian administrative detainees, land annexation, and the armed settler attacks, as well as Israeli extrajudicial executions. We'll be delving in depth with today's speakers. Our first speaker of today's panel discussion is Arab Barghouthi. Arab is a Palestinian activist that has been working for the campaign to release his father, Marwan Barghouthi, and all Palestinian political prisoners, responsible for international relations with 12 years of experience in the business and entrepreneurship field in Palestine. Over to you.
Thank you, Farah. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I think that usually when we want to speak about Palestine, we really hope there comes a time that we can speak about the good things that are happening in our home, because everyone knows our homeland is going through pain right now that has been accumulated over decade after decade. But the last year has been the toughest year for any Palestinian or any free person all over the world. Because I think what everyone is realizing is that we Palestinians are not only going against the Israeli occupation and oppression, we're also going against the big powers all over the world that don't really care about everyone, if they're, an Arab, brown person or something like that. We don't count. And I think that the fact has been shown to all of us in the last 12 months. The pain that is going in Gaza is undescribable, and I think that other speakers will get into the details, but we have to remember the current humanitarian crisis that is going on, and we need to imagine ourselves as the people that are going through what is happening in Gaza. The mass displacement, the slaughter, the burning people alive, and bragging about killing leaders who are, defending this land and against the illegal occupation of our lands. I think that everybody knows what's happening in Gaza is a crime against humanity, is against not only the international law, but against the principles of humanity. I think that many leaders around the world have lost touch with their humanity when they are justifying and explaining why killing 17 and 18,000 children is basically okay. And I think because our talk is focusing on what's happening in the West Bank, as Farah mentioned, I think that the Israeli occupation knows exactly what they're doing, and they know that everybody's attention is on their genocide in Gaza and their war crimes that are happening in Lebanon. They're using all that to unleash their oppression against us in the West Bank. In the West Bank, we see all the time, every single day, we have land theft. We have settlers who are terrorizing our population, and we are going through so much limitations on movement. The day-to-day life is becoming harder and harder, and that's something that they, of course, planned before, and now they're planning more and more. I think that the settlement expansion is something that will keep hurting any future solution. They keep speaking about solutions, and then they keep, doing all that and building settlements, knowing what they're killing. They're killing that illusion, the magic word that they keep hypnotizing the Palestinian people with, which is the two-state solution, and that we will have solution at the end. It's very obvious. The solution is ethnically cleansing the whole Palestinian population. I want to shed the light on something else that the Israelis are taking advantage of. The fact that we are all busy with their genocide that is taking place, which is the prisoners issue. And we need to remember that the prisoners issue is an issue that hits the majority of the Palestinian people. 25% of the Palestinian population has been at least arrested once in their lives. My brother spent years in prison. My uncle spent years, if not decades, some of them in prisons. My father is spending his 23rd year in prison. This is something that messes with all Palestinians. I don't know anyone who doesn't know someone or have family in their family, in a family member in their family as a political prisoner. There is absolutely no accountability of imprisoning someone. They can just come to my house, terrorize the whole building, take me, and go to back to prison, and without trial, put me in administrative detention, which is something that's happening at the moment with 3 of my cousins. In the last year, more than thousands of Palestinian political prisoners. We have estimations because they don't give us any real numbers, but we think that there are 11,000 prisoners at the moment that are being held. So, a lot of them without trial, and a lot of them have been there for decades. And of course, their trial has a 99.7%. 99.7% conviction rate against Palestinians. And of course, we have 2 different legal systems, one for Israeli settlers who are settling in the West Bank, and another one for us under occupation, under military occupation and military rule. And to give you some details about what's happening in prisons, we lost many prisoners. We know the recorded ones are 10s, 40, 50, 55. We hear all these numbers. That's aside from the undocumented cases of prisoners that are getting killed inside prison with absolutely no accountability. The other thing is that also they beat them up. They make them go hungry for days to barely survive. They terrorize the prisoners every single day. They make their lives hell. As part of the collective punishment that the Israeli occupation is practicing against us Palestinians. And then you hear about a humanitarian law, and you read it, and you see that there is a huge problem with the humanitarian law against collective punishment. If what's happening in Palestine is not collective punishment, I don't know what is. We're all getting punished. For what? For resisting our occupier, which is also legal by international law. My father has been in prison for 23 years. He was one of the leaders of Fatah in the Second Intifada, and he was arrested, even though he's a parliamentarian and he's someone who is a leader, and unapologetically he supported the Second Intifada, because the Intifada means the uprising against the Israeli occupation. I know they made the word mean, I know, weird things, but when it comes to Intifada, it means the uprising against the Israeli occupation, because what happened is that they played us in Oslo Accords into that illusion of the two-state solution, and then they did not commit to anything that they promised. Netanyahu came to power in 96, and he decided that it's time to sabotage the deal. And my father, as a leader of Fatah back then, he led the Intifada, and he was arrested, kidnapped from Ramallah in 2002. And he refused to have a defense because he did not recognize the legitimacy of the Israeli court to have him and convict him as a Palestinian parliament member and as a politician. He went to prison. He got his PhD inside prison. He started teaching prisoners after staying for 3 years in solitary confinement. He was finally out, and he started teaching other prisoners in different teachings. He graduated more than 400 bachelor's degree prisoners and more than 100 of master's degrees. And he is someone who truly appreciates life. He's someone who's always present, always positive about the future. I have never been to prison to visit him, which is very rare to happen. Every 2 3 years they allow me once, and we have glass between us, and of course it's a hell of a trip, but of course it's worth it. I at least get to see him behind the glass, and he's always smiling. He's never complained about life. He's never been one to be negative, and he taught me that we are on the right side of history, and when you are on the right side of history, you sleep well, and you do your best, and you keep going, and you don't stop if things seem as if it's impossible for things to change. And that taught me hope, and this is something that I would love to share with you. And I want everyone to have that hope, because even though it all looks as if nothing will happen and change will never happen, I think that change will happen. And that's what history taught us, and what oppressed people who finally got out of their oppression have taught us. And the last thing I want to just say is that my father is in solitary confinement since last year. He's been through a lot. He was beaten up until he passed out in March. And it was very hard on us as a family, but we know that the only time that the lawyer has been able to see him, which was 3 months ago, he said that he wanted to make sure that his smile is on his face. He wanted to show the prison guards that whatever they do, they wouldn't break him, even that they were savages against him, and they basically had his shoulder dislocated, and many injuries in his body. But he's still the same. He's still strong, and he's still going. And I truly hope that his message stays, which is that he always tells me the same and reminds me the same, that we have a just cause, and we Palestinians are like any other nation. We deserve to live in freedom, dignity, and to feel independent, and we're not gonna accept to be an exception. And I hope that this message gets to as many people as we can, because what the people of Gaza are doing is that they are fighting for the freedom of all of us. And I truly hope that we can get to a point where the children of Gaza get what they deserve, which is to live in peace and live a normal life like any other child in the whole world.
Thank you so much for your input there, Arab. It was really good to hear your point of view and to hear the trials and tribulations that come with being Palestinian, having relatives who are political prisoners, and we're all wishing the best for your dad, and freedom is not far away. Thank you again. Our next speaker of today's panel discussion is Khulud Al-Jarma. She is a Palestinian refugee, anthropologist, and award-winning photographer and filmmaker. She is a lecturer at the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Edinburgh. She has also worked in the fields of refugee studies, international migration, gender studies, visual culture, environmental justice, and knowledge production in the Arab region, Europe, and Latin America. Over to you, Khulud.
Thank you, Farah, and thank you for the Palestinian Return Center for organizing this timely webinar. For my intervention today, I'd like to speak about a specific segment of the horrors that we've been seeing in the West Bank, more specifically the farmers and what the farmers have been enduring in the past years within the attacks of the settler colonial state. As the world has been witnessing the horrific genocide unfolding in Gaza for the past year, it is also important to recognize that the ethnic cleansing that has been going is much longer. For many years, Gaza has been seeing it, and the West Bank as well, and the entirety of historic Palestine. During this past year, there has been intensification of the violence by the Israeli settler colonial regime and the settlers also against the Palestinians in the West Bank. And here I'll talk about specifically about the agriculture and the farmers, because these months in particular, the months of October and November, normally in Palestine are months of celebrations of tradition and culture, because they are the olive harvest season for Palestinians. And agriculture has been the backbone of Palestinian life for generations, and Palestine's lands have always been fertile, plentiful, and all the trees that has grown on its land are a testimony of that. But probably no tree had longer history than that of the olive tree in Palestine. The olive tree holds profound cultural and symbolic value for the Palestinian society. For generations, the olive harvest has been central for Palestinian life, fostering a sense of continuity and resilience. And families and communities have always come together during this season to collect the olives from the groves that have been passed down through ancestral inheritance. The olive tree itself symbolizes peace, sumud, and steadfastness, and not only in Palestinian culture, but across religious traditions and in the region as well. But in Palestine, arguably, is the home of the oldest olive tree in the universe, which is the Badawi tree, a tree that have survived for over 4,000 years in the village of Walaji near Bethlehem. And this is one of the oldest in the world, but also there are many trees on Palestinian lands that are arguably thousands of years old, a living testament of the region's deep-rooted agricultural heritage. Nonetheless, the Palestinian farmers had to struggle against the ongoing attempts to drive them away from their lands, denying them access or deliberate destruction of their trees and their harvests. Palestinian farmers have faced physical assaults, vandalism, the destruction of their olive trees and other trees, and also some of these have been documented extensively, but some have not been documented because they have become the norm. Since 1967, over 800,000 Palestinian olive trees, and in some resources, 1 million olive trees, have been uprooted by Israeli settlers and authorities. Such actions not only cause immediate financial losses, but also inflict long-term damage, as farmers are denied access to the lands that they have cultivated by their families for generations. But also, to replace each destroyed olive tree needs years of work on the land to grow a tree into a fruit-bearing tree. So this is a great fear that Palestinian farmers have to live through every single day. Nonetheless, Palestinians still have around 12 million olive trees, which cover nearly half of the West Bank's agricultural lands, which continues to make olive oil production as a vital food security issue and also a significant contributor to the Palestinian economy. The Palestinian Ministry of Agriculture nonetheless said that the farmers this year will not be able to access around 80,000 dunams, nearly 20,000 acres of the olive planted lands due to the attacks by the Israeli settlers and army. And because some of these lands are adjacent or behind the Israeli apartheid wall, which makes it very difficult for the landowners to reach their lands. This means roughly the loss of about 15% of the season's crops. The 2023 season was difficult also, where about 100,000 dunams of olive groves across the West Bank remained unharvested due to the Israeli restrictions on the Palestinian access to the land. This impact was particularly harsh in the northern governorates, such as Tulkarem, Qalqilia, and Nablus, and also within the Jordan Valley, where Palestinian farmers could not reach their lands due to the ongoing settler attacks. The violence against Palestinian farmers is part of a broader Israeli policy of land seizure and settlement expansion in the West Bank. Earlier this year, Israel approved the largest seizure of Palestinian land in the West Bank in 3 decades, resulting in the establishment of new settlements and roads exclusively for Israeli settlers. These settlements are often located in agricultural areas, displacing Palestinian farmers, cutting them access to water resources, and destroying their means of livelihood. In the village of Batir near Bethlehem, for example, a new settlement was established on Palestinian farmlands, with settlers prevented local farmers from accessing olive groves for the second year this year. And this expansion of settlements and the violence that accompanies it is systematic. The settlers face no legal accountability for their actions. They're often supported and backed by the Israeli army itself. And they also attack the olive groves, sometimes setting them on fire, adding more to the destruction. And also one of the new phenomenons that we see is the stealing of the olive harvest. So in places like Sebastia near Nablus, the farmers would go and harvest their olives, and by the end of the day, when they have their harvest ready to be taken home, the settlers would attack them and would steal whatever they have picked and take it back to the settlement, which also adds to the suffering of the Palestinian farmers after long days of work. In Masafer Yatta as well, for example, in the South Hebron Hills, there's massive uprooting of trees as a way to force the people who live on these lands also to leave the lands when their trees are being uprooted. So it's another way of ethnic cleansing through uprooting these olive trees. In the Jordan Valley, the Israeli army uses what they call firing zones, places where the army practices on Palestinian lands, destroying the trees, killing the animals, and also endangering the local communities. And the list goes on and on with many other examples of how settler attacks have intensified over the past year, but also have endangered whole communities and their way of living. Within Palestinian culture, we have a tradition that is called Aoune or Faza, which is when the olive harvest comes, many people from the local community go and help those who are collecting their olives. This has been a tradition that have lived in Palestine for generations, but the importance and significance of this faza has intensified in the past few years, because the more people who are present on the land, the harder it is for the settlers to come and attack them. One of the ways that people have tried in these past years to do it is to recruit international volunteers to come to Palestine during that time and help the farmers in the olive harvest. This has worked for a few years, as these volunteers would act as witnesses and may hopefully provide some protection with their presence against the settler violence. However, the number of tourists, let's call them, that come to Palestine have shrank drastically since last year, which also means that the number of volunteers who could be there to help the farmers this year would be much less. And the actual ability of the farmers to get to their lands is harder, with more roadblocks between cities and villages and more intensified settler violence that we're witnessing on a daily basis, and often not seen important enough to even make it to the news pages, either online or in media in general. So this violence against Palestinian farmers during the olive harvest season and against Palestinian farmers and lands in general is part of a broader context of colonization and dispossession that Palestinians have endured and continue to endure. The olive tree, with its deep cultural, historical, and economic significance, is just one symbol of how Palestinians are steadfast in this face of adversity. Yet the ongoing attacks and land seizures, the settler violence, continues to threaten and undermine not only the livelihood of the farmers, but also the very fabric of the Palestinian identity and connection to the land. And let me finish with a verse by Mahmoud Darwish, who said in a poem called An Sumud about steadfastness, if the olive trees knew the hands that cultivated them or planted them, their oil would have become tears. And he finishes that poem with, we will remain a shield around the land. And I hope that the farmers and all of the Palestinians will remain that shield that will protect our lands against the settler colonial project. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Khulud, for your input and your invaluable contribution. I have heard that before about the oldest olive tree being in Palestine, and I don't think a lot of people actually know that. And then also that would link back as well to Palestinians' history in Palestine, which goes back 4,000 years, which literally goes back to time itself of that tree being planted, of everything that exists in that land. Thank you so much, Khulud, and our next speaker of today's panel discussion is Saeb Sheth. Saeb is an internationally recognized Middle East political expert, author, and a political contributor to many alternative media platforms across the world. Former diplomat, he was the Palestine representative in Ireland, headed the Palestine General Delegation to Ireland until 2002. He is the chairman of the Palestine Aid Charity and a co-founder of Irish MAP, Medical Aid for Palestine. He was behind the building of James Connolly surgical units in Al Auda Hospital in Gaza City. Saeb is also the coordinator of the General of the Road to Hope convoy, which against all odds broke through the Israeli illegal blockade of Gaza and brought medical and humanitarian aid to Gaza's medical facilities on the 28th of November 2010. Saeb's book, The Arabian Gulf States and International Oil Monopolies, the book proved to be one of the classics to all anti-imperialist domination in the Arab world. Over to you, Saeb.
Hello, everyone. I want to focus this time collective of issues, which Khulud mentioned some of it, about the violence of the settlers, mainly in historical Palestine. We know the Zionist entity is actively advancing the long-term conflict management strategy. I want to focus on the side of the West Bank from that strategy. So this strategy used on the West Bank to reinforce their colonial settlement of the occupied West Bank and Al-Quds, Jerusalem, to expand its racist colonialist project that it has built over decades between the river and the sea, which is just summarize the ideology of the Likud party. The Palestinians' counterattack on the 7th of October against the Zionist entity shattered this Zionist myth that the Jewish settlements could ensure security along the Zionist entity borders, which is in 1948 lines, we say the armistice lines. The Palestinians' counterattack as well shattered that illusion of keeping the Palestinians under control, denied no human rights or national rights, as the right of movement, as Arab mentioned, or the right of even national self-determination. The international community see clearly that the Zionist entity no longer makes any effort to hide its racist objectives. For instance, if we look at the Jewish nation-state law of 2018, states that the right to exercise national self-determination in the state of quote unquote, they call it Israel, is unique to the Jewish people, and that the state views the development of Jewish settlements as a national value. Going further, the current Zionist entity's government statement, known as the guiding principles, which arrogantly in 2022 declared that the Jewish people have an exclusive and absolute right to all areas of the land of Israel. And the government statement promised to strengthen and develop settlements throughout the land of Israel. The land of Israel, which in Hebrew lexicon include Gaza and the West Bank. Of course, the West Bank to them is the Holy Grail, I call it, which is the jewels of the crown. And they call it Judah and Samira. It's religious to them as well. So the apartheid regime is not just a crime against humanity, but it's an unstable itself and very violent system itself, endangers its surrounding areas, neighboring countries, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, and further, and damages everything it touches. So to guarantee of impunity by the West, this government is unashamedly provide the Zionist entity with and actively helping it helping it with impunity, shielding it from the international law, and entrench the apartheid regime and supports its genocidal war as well, which is not just on Gaza. We've seen it in a slow action in the north of the West Bank, in Tulkarem, in Jenin. So the Zionist military occupation of the West Bank and Al-Quds, it translates straight away into building illegal colonial settlements, as accelerating the land grab through settlements expansion, and to follow by annexation of the West Bank in the future, as they did in two areas, the Al-Quds, which they issued Jerusalem, a law for that, and officially the state annexing that, and the Golan Heights, and then becomes a president like Trump in the United States of America and recognize this as a Zionist territory. So this kind of policies of the West is entrenched the occupation in the West Bank and help more settlers as well to move in, protected by the Zionist entities government, and then they start on their own land grab, and you can find the government then justifying building these settlements as stating it as security requirement. Today in Al-Quds, I know Dawood going to speak about that in Jerusalem, there is nearly 230,000 colonial settlers lives in East Jerusalem alone, and there is over 600,000 in the rest of the occupied West Bank, both of which are internationally recognized as occupied territory. Then when we look at the Khulud was mentioning, the systematic and growing violence by the Zionist colonialist settlers against Palestinians in occupied West Bank. They are committed by armed gangs of young men. They call themselves the Boys of the Hills. They are protected by the occupation army and the police. The ongoing aggressive acts it have a wide variety of kind of violent intimidation, harassment, physical assault on Palestinians, cutting the trees, burning the trees, uprooting the olive trees, destroying the farms, stealing and killing farmers' livestock. As Khulud mentioned them, these items, and then denying the people access to their own land and water. Then there is other issues like burning children alive on 31st of July 2015. We remember settlers firebombed Palestinian family home in the village of Douma. 18-month-old Ali Dawabshi was burned alive, and his parents, they burned, but they survived with severe injuries. And then a few days later, they died. In 23, settlers went on the storm of Hawara and Termus Aya, and we terrorized the whole population in there, attacked their properties, businesses, burning houses, farms, cars. The same violence is being repeated in many villages and towns. Settler attacks have included organized assaults on land control and on the establishment of settlements outposts, which is resulted in as well after that. The violence itself as well aims to expand settlements and deny the Palestinian access to their land and farms and properties, as I mentioned, then dispossesses the Palestinians, displacing them, and then denying them any hope of peace in the future. And the result is ethnically cleansing them, increasingly the settlers are acting in harmony with their army. And lately we've seen a lot of them wearing the army uniforms, brandishing the guns which Ben Gvir gave them. So we see the Zionist entities, government minister, and the settlers leaders and community leaders are to openly support settler attacks on the Palestinians. Settlers' violence have gone unchecked by international community, who became deaf to the Palestinian cries for help. Every day, the news full of Palestinian farmers being attacked and displaced by settlers. But since October, the 7th of October of 23, things got even worse in the West Bank. There have been countless incidents of settlers' violence against most of Palestinians of the West Bank. And a lot of it is documented, and thousands of Palestinians have been driven away from their homes and towns. West Bank have witnessed a huge kind of boom in colonial settlements activity in the last year after the 7th of October. In a few months alone, the settlers received more assault weapons, and they using it as well in the grabbing lots, not lots, thousands of acres of Palestinian lands in the West Bank. They are enjoying active protection from occupation army and the police officers, who see their primary obligation is to protect the settlers from Palestinian victims or maybe violent reaction and self-defense. That's what they see as their duty. Early this year, the Zionist entity approved the largest seizure of land in occupied West Bank. In 3 decades, the move was followed by unprecedented increase in the number of random settlements and new roads being built and outposts to serve the settlers as well. Today, we can see the settlers control the Zionist entity itself through their own ministers. Settlers were handed over the power to rule the West Bank affairs. The Zionists themselves call their government as the settlers' government. You have Smotrich, who's on top of being the finance minister, which he deploys this ministry to delays the Palestinian tax clearing, call it in Arabic al-Maqasa, which is being inaugurated in the 1994 Paris Protocol. So you can see that Smotrich became the de facto ruler of the West Bank. He is the director of civil administration in there, and anything in the West Bank to do with the Palestinians or the settlers have to be approved by this man. And this man is, we know how fanatic and ideological fanatic against the Palestinians. And on the other hand, you have Ben Gvir, the same kind of brand, the Zionist security minister, who armed all the settlers of the occupied West Bank and help them and direct them how to attack and to commit their violence against the Palestinians. So we can see the Zionist entities government endorse the violence, in short, by framing it as self-defense in the battle for the land of, call it the land of Israel, which they say they are entitled to. Now, I want to mention something before I finish, which is the Western sanctions and Western involvement in here. Recently, we've seen and hear the US and some of the Western European countries have imposed sanctions on some violent settlers, they call them. Such sanctions stresses the narrative of a few bad boys who are acting outside the law against the state's law and policies, state of the Zionist entity. Such Western sanctions against a few violent settlers in reality shield the Zionist entities, government, and its settlers from queries or investigations by international law and international humanitarian law. So actively, they are covering up the Zionist entity and its policies of land grab and encouragement for the collective settlers' violence against the Palestinians, since they know in the future these stolen lands will be recognized, as we mentioned, by Trump himself, who has been tweeting lately about the Zionist entity, saying it's too tiny. And we know this man, he is the one who recognized Jerusalem is the eternal capital for the Zionist entity, and as well recognize the annexation of the Golan Heights against all the odds of the international law, and even built a settlement in there in the Golan Heights called the Trump. So most of Western powers do intentionally ignore that much of responsibility lies within the Zionist entity and its ministers for this settlers of violence, who they are supporting the settlers violence campaign that making many parts of the West Bank increasingly unlivable for the Palestinians. Okay, the European government could enforce, if they want, rules to ban trade in the Zionist entities goods made at least in the West Bank settlements. Western countries can stop settlements expansion on settlers violence if they decided to use their own like any military aid, economic aid, trade, and many other fields, scientific cooperation and education, even student exchange. All of these things can hurt the Zionist entity. Such move would impose a greater cost on the Zionist entity and will force it to change course, at least slightly. The US in here, we know for a fact, and the European consider sanctions against the Zionist entity government as a tool, which in the end of the day will force the Zionist entity to change policies. But the Western powers are not interested unless their own people in the future can force their government to look into their complicity in supporting all the crimes being committed by such entity, the crimes in the West Bank or the genocide is going in Gaza. Before this is happening, the West will hardly ever be stop at least shielding or providing impunity for the Zionist entity. It fails upon their own population to decide that the time comes for their own governments to look into their complicity in genocide in Palestine. And the United States of America is not complicit, it's leading the genocide. So this is the situation in the West Bank and in Gaza. If the West don't move quick enough, their population, not the government, you'll see it, which is already spilling over in Damascus today, and in Lebanon yesterday, and tomorrow maybe in Iraq and Egypt or Yemen. So this issue demand a lot of attention from everyday individual in every Western capital. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saib, for your input. And it was really interesting to delve into depth there as well, that the escalating situation that we are seeing in the West Bank, that also didn't start in October. You mentioned the story of Ali Dawabsha, which I would recommend everyone who's tuning into, who may not know, to look into that and look into Price Tag, a settler vigilante group, and how settler violence has always been there since the creation of the settler colony. Thank you again, Saib. Our next speaker of today's panel discussion is Dawood Khattab. Dawood is a Palestinian journalist and media activist. He is the former Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton University. He is also currently the Director General of Community Media Network, CMN, a not-for-profit organization dedicated to advancing independent media in the Arab region. CMN is registered in Jordan and Palestine and administers Radio Al-Balad in Amman. He was also elected as the deputy chair of the Vienna-based International Press Institute. He's a regular columnist with Washington, D.C.-based Al Monitor and a Middle East reporter with Arab News. He's a frequent contributor to the Washington Post, the Middle East Institute, Project Syndicate, and other publications. He's the author of Sesame Street, Palestine by Bear Manor Publishing. Over to you, Dawood.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the Return Center, and thank you for giving us a chance. I often hear the word West Bank and Jerusalem, and I don't like that term because we consider Jerusalem as part of the West Bank, and it is part of the areas that were occupied in June 1967. So when we talk about Jerusalem, it has to be always talked about within the concept of those areas occupied in 1967, even though Israel has illegally and unilaterally annexed East Jerusalem to Israel and passed Israeli law on Jerusalem. It's still an occupied area according to international law. And when we talk about Jerusalem, 350,000 Palestinians, we talk about a population which is a kind of I would call them political orphans. They are not part of the Palestinian government or Palestinian political process. In fact, if a Palestinian carries out any action or any project that is connected to the Palestinian government in Ramallah, that project is cancelled, including a puppet festival in Al Hakawat in Jerusalem was cancelled because it was funded by Norwegian money that was channeled through the Palestinian Ministry of Culture and things like that. So Palestinians are not allowed to communicate or to receive money from the Palestinian government, and yet at the same time Israel does not give them any political rights. They are not allowed to establish their own political movements or parties. The Orient House, which was the center of Palestinian politics before the Oslo Accords, has been closed down using the 1945 British emergency laws now, 6, 70, 80 years since then. And when we talk about Jerusalem, obviously, the first topic of discussion is the holy places in the Holy Basin or in the Old City of Jerusalem, which is considered, the entire Old City of Jerusalem is considered UNESCO World Heritage Site, which means that no one is allowed to change the situation in the Old City, and especially in Al-Haram Sharif Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is 144 dunums of land that has been the property and the religious site, third holiest site in Islam. It has been a constant target of Israelis who consider it to be holy to them because of their consideration that below it somehow there used to be a Jewish temple some 30,000 years ago, and they consider that place to be holy. And they have been basically entering to the mosque area and violating the international law, which is considered the status quo. The status quo is an agreement in 1852 that was signed by the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan, which says that holy places must be run by the different organizations and churches and Islamic Waqf organizations that have been controlling them. And as a result, we have seen constant clashes in Al-Aqsa Mosque. We've seen Israelis controlling one of the gates to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Al-Mughrabi Gate, and basically controlling who enters and who leaves without the consent of the owners of the mosque. The mosque is sponsor, or it's Jordanian family, Hashemite family are the custodians of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And recently, the zealous religious fanatics have been eyeing a small part of the mosque called Bab al-Rahmeh, and they're trying to occupy that area and have a kind of an entrance to it from what is called the Golden Gates, the unopened gates. And it's very scary that the Israelis are really pushing hard this theological religious fanaticism of trying to take over the mosque and to control it both by space and by time. And it is a violation of an agreement. It's a violation of the peace agreement between Jordan and Israel, and also it's a violation of a US-sponsored agreement. But in addition to the problem of Al-Aqsa, we also see that the Israelis are discriminating against the Christian community. Priests are often spat on. The Armenian Quarter land has been under question because a Jewish developer is trying to build a hotel against the rights and the will of the community there. Apparently, their patriarch at one time signed a document, he has since rescinded that document, but the Jewish developer has been trying to control this and has been refusing to give up the land, and has been using thugs to try to scare the community to give up almost one fourth of the Armenian Quarter. Outside of the old city, the biggest problem right now continues to be the housing problem. Israel, since 1967, has not allowed a single zoning plan. 2 years ago, they were about to approve a zoning plan in the Beit Hanina Palestinian neighborhood, but at the last moment, the Israeli municipality rejected that. And so we've not had a single zoning plan, and as a result, less than 2% of all applications for housing in East Jerusalem are granted. 98% are denied. And in addition to this, Israelis have been demolishing houses, both occupied and unoccupied. About 40,000 Palestinians have been basically have suffered because of these house demolitions. Just in the last year, just in 1 year, 40,000 people have been affected. 125 inhabited homes and 28 uninhabited homes have been demolished by the Israelis. And the Israelis have a very crude system. If you don't agree to demolish your own house, they will come and demolish it and they send you the bill. And if you don't pay the bill, you cannot travel. They arrest you at the borders and they force you to pay the bill. So people who build homes because they cannot get a housing license are forced sometimes to destroy their own homes just so that they can avoid having to pay the fees of the Israelis who destroy the homes. Outside of the religious part, outside of the housing issue, a big problem is in education. And we have, since 1967, there's been a constant fight over the educational system. The Israelis tried to impose in 1967 the Israeli curriculum, and Palestinians all walked out. Families totally went to other West Bank cities in Bethlehem and Ramallah. And eventually the Israelis surrendered and allowed the Jordanian curriculum, and then after the Oslo Agreement, the Palestinian curriculum. But since then, the right-wing governments, the settler government that you've heard talk about, has also tried to enforce its own radical will by refusing the Palestinian curriculum, especially the Palestinian civic policy curriculum, which talks about the history of Palestine and the history of the region. And they've crudely replaced, Al-Aqsa Mosque with the Jewish temple. Words of a martyr are called terrorists. And the Israeli police often stand outside schools and they force students who carry in their bags the book. And if they don't have, they open their suitcase and they have the Palestinian issued curriculum, they take it out and remove it. And it has become almost a cat and mouse game with Palestinians trying to hold on to their Palestinian curriculum books while the Israelis are using very unusual and crude tactics to force their own political narrative. And, this is maybe the biggest problem we have with the Israelis is that they have a narrative of their own. They have their own idea of what is going on and what should be going on. And they're trying to force their narrative down everybody's throat. They're trying to say, this is God-given territory. The land was given to them by God 3,000 years ago, and that they have a right for Jewish supremacy. The Jews have a right for an apartheid situation where they are the rulers, and the Palestinians are third, fourth, fifth class, not even citizens, but occupants that the Israelis' generosity is allowing them to stay there. And of course, in Jerusalem, we've had thousands of Palestinians who've lost their right to live in Jerusalem because unlike Palestinians in the rest of the West Bank who get Palestinian passports, the population in East Jerusalem have to live on a residency permit, a permanent residency permit. And if you leave Jerusalem, or if Jerusalem is not the center of your life for a period, if you go to school or if you go to a university or if you work outside and don't return on a regular basis, they remove your right. You become a tourist in your own birthplace. And this has happened to tens of thousands of Palestinians who've lost their right to live in their own country, in their own homes where they've grown up. And this is just an indication of how discriminatory the Israeli system is, where Jews are given a supremacy over the rest of the population. So we all know that no solution will happen in Palestine without Jerusalem being part of it, and Palestinians are insisting that Jerusalem and East Jerusalem should be part of the Palestinian state, regardless of what happens. This has always been an issue for the Israelis, and even after the Oslo Accords, when Palestinians signed an agreement with the Israelis to allow Palestinians to vote absentee using the post offices in East Jerusalem, even that symbolic issue has now been denied to Palestinians. And as a result, we've not been able to have national elections. I mean, some people say this was an excuse by the Palestinian government, but in reality, the Israelis have denied Palestinians the right to, as I said earlier, to have their own political activities or to be part of a political movement. The political rights, which are an inalienable right for people, and especially in a country that considers itself, quote unquote, a democracy, denying Palestinians the political rights of establishing their own political bodies is another example of the apartheid system that we all live in, whether we live in Jerusalem or Ramallah or Gaza. Palestinians are treated in a discriminatory fashion, and it's a war crime to allow, to continue allowing this Israeli policy in which Israel rules by law in a way that discriminates against the population. So the situation in Jerusalem, like it is in the rest of the West Bank, is very difficult. Israelis have built an 8-foot high wall that prevents Palestinians from traveling from the rest of the West Bank to Jerusalem. Muslims and Christians are not allowed to enter their own holy places unless they have a permit, which is very hard to get. The only time that they make some exceptions is during Ramadan, because the floods of people coming in forces them to sometimes allow people to enter. But in general, attendance to your holy place to worship in, whether you're Muslim or Christian, is highly restricted by the Israelis, who consider every Palestinian to be a terrorist, and that you have to make an exception for one or two, but basically they act as if the entire population are terrorists. Life is difficult in Jerusalem. Life is difficult in all of the West. And I think it's important for the people to know that, yes, Gaza is suffering now from a genocide, but the future of the Palestinian people is to live under their own government, to practice their own self-determination, whether it's in the West Bank, including Jerusalem, whether it's in Gaza, as well as the right of refugees to return to their homeland. These are the basic rights of Palestinians, and I think all Palestinians share and have a consensus on the right of determining their own future by themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daoud, for your contribution and explaining the intricacies of Israeli oppression, how different the different forms of oppression look like depending on where you're from in Palestine, and that it isn't all the same or identical. It's actually multifaceted. Thank you again, Daoud. Our next speaker of this evening's panel discussion and today's final speaker is Ramzi Baroud. Ramzi is a journalist, author, and the editor of the Palestine Chronicle. He is the author of 6 books. His latest book, co-edited with Ilan Pape, is Our Vision for Liberation: Engaged Palestinian Leaders and Intellectuals Speak Out. His other books include My Father Was a Freedom Fighter and The Last Earth. Baroud is a non-resident senior research fellow at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, CIGA. Unfortunately, Ramzi can't be with us in today's live stream, but we have pre-recorded a video of Ramzi to include now, and we'll be playing this video, and then the event, today's panel discussion, will be finished. And I'd just like to remind everyone at home to please follow Palestinian Return Center's Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter page to keep up to date on all of our upcoming events. Now over to Ramzi's video.
Hello everyone, my name is Ramzi Baroud and I'm happy to be joining you right now. I think it's, the West Bank question is a very critical one. For us Palestinians, we have been engaging with a different type of context regarding the West Bank, as in, why hasn't the West Bank risen in the kind of expected intifada in response to the Israeli genocide in Gaza, and also in response to what is happening in the West Bank itself, the systematic campaign of murder and violence in the northern West Bank and Jenin, Nablus, Farah, Tubas, and other areas. I mean, isn't this a historical moment in which the West Bank should be rising in this, much discussed third intifada? What are the factors that is preventing that from happening? But of course, there's another context to this: is what does Israel want from the West Bank in the first place? I mean, let's remember that when before the war on Gaza started, say October 6, 2023, Gaza wasn't really on the radar, was it? I mean, it was a place that has been under a hermetic siege for many years, in which Palestinians were confined behind walls, barbed wires, checkpoints, and a system or a matrix of absolute control using all means of kind of technological means, violence, military snipers, all the stuff that we are all familiar with. So Gaza wasn't really part of the political equation as far as Israel is concerned. Gaza has incredibly succeeded in not only becoming the center of the equation, but kind of pushing us to rethink everything we thought was happening in Palestine, the normalization and oh, the people is forgetting about Palestine. It's no longer a global issue. We are thinking about some other issues, for example, the war in Ukraine, the struggle between America and China, specifically in the Pacific region, the South China Sea, and all of that. And the Middle East was not on the cards anymore. To the contrary, the Middle East was just basically a discussion about the speed of normalization of the Arabs and the Muslims who are betraying Palestine, and it's just a done deal, more or less. This little space, this little region, Gaza, 181 square miles, 360 or 365 square kilometers, managed to prove that it can still be the most important geopolitical spot on Earth without itself having a geostrategic importance, without having natural resources, or at least natural resources that are under the control of Palestinians in Gaza, and so on. I mean, it really has forced everybody to rethink the entire concept of of geopolitics. Um, I don't want to delve too deep into this issue, but the point I'm trying to make is that it really wasn't Gaza that was being discussed, it was the West Bank. Because the West Bank has the kind of territories that are necessary for an expansionist regime, settler colonial regime like Israel, to maintain that identity. I mean, you can't be a settler colonial regime if you are no longer a settler colonial regime. You have to build settlements, you have to expand existing settlements, you have to steal more land, you have to ethnically cleanse more Palestinians, you have to destroy more olive orchards, and you have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing, one house at a time, as in Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, one piece of land at a time, one village at a time, and so forth. The Israeli wall in the West Bank has kind of been the demarcation of the colonial or the settler colonial ambitions of Israel. And over the years, the kind of the constant snaking of that wall, the constant shifting of the direction of the wall, is just kind of indicative of where Israel was heading as far as the annexation of the West Bank was concerned. Until we got to 2020, when Israel has decided to change its de facto annexation of the West Bank into de jure annexation of the West Bank. Because, I mean, let's be honest. I mean, Israel has annexed the West Bank. Israel, as far as its Israeli politics is concerned, and all intents and purposes, Israel does not see itself as an occupying power in the West Bank. Only international law sees Israel as occupying power, and many countries around the world, in fact, the vast majority of countries and governments around the world, see Israel as an occupying power. The word military occupation is not a swear word, it's a legal term. It was created by the international community and highlighted in the Geneva Conventions in order for international law to delineate the relationship and the responsibilities, the legal responsibility of the occupying power against the occupied nation. But Israel has managed to turn that, what is supposed to be a temporary process into a permanent process. Thus, this protracted, long Israeli military occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. But Israel doesn't see itself as such. Israel acts as if it has already annexed the West Bank, and it doesn't even use the term annexation. I mean, it doesn't even use the word the West Bank. They refer to it as Yehuda and Samaria, a biblical term, and we all know that. Now, Israel in 2020 has decided to finally push for what they call the transfer. The transfer is an old idea that always existed and subsisted within the margins of Israeli mainstream politics, within the far right, the extremists, then slightly to the right, and eventually became mainstream core idea. They don't call it transfer anymore, they just call it annexation. Well, annexation requires the transfer of large number of Palestinians from areas that could pose some kind of a so-called demographic threat to Israel. And therefore, when they proposed annexation in 2020, they were speaking specifically about taking, I think, about 40% of the West Bank as a starting point in areas that are least populated, and then build settlements, new walls, and then push more and more and more until they have total control over the West Bank. That was the idea for various reasons, including international pressures and the fact that it seems that the international community wasn't yet ready to accept this new so-called facts on the ground imposed by Israel. Israel failed to bring about that uh, de jure annexation of the West Bank, and they changed into a different kind of like became more emboldened in terms of the de facto annexation. So since then, even though everybody was celebrating like, oh, Israel is not going to be annexing, Israel has changed the plan, they didn't. They really didn't. What they actually did is that they began to accelerate the settlements, building new settlements, and the land theft. And while we are talking about Gaza, thousands of Palestinians in the West Bank have already been annexed from their areas. In fact, in the latest Israeli invasion of Jenin, they made calls to all the people in the northern West Bank or to many villages and to leave temporarily, they said, until we sort out this security threat. But what they really meant is they wanted the people out permanently. So I think what Israel is hoping to achieve by prolonging its war on Gaza, aside from having what they call security control over Gaza, is to create the needed space to do whatever it wants to do in the West Bank. They couldn't do that in 2020 because there was too much pressure, too much attention on the story, too many people, international entities, governments, civil societies, mass protests. They just did not feel like this is the kind of issue that they could achieve under these circumstances. But now we are living in a different kind of circumstances. They are carrying out a genocide and nobody is stopping them. Yes, there's so much anger, so much rage, but as far as the killing of people, it continues every day. That hasn't changed in the least. And if they, in their mind, feel like they are getting away with genocide in Gaza, what's the problem of getting away with, just a simple act of annexation in the West Bank? This is what Israel wants in the West Bank. This is why they hired a new military administrator. Remember the civil administration system that they imposed in 1981, and they ruled the West Bank and Gaza based on this so-called civil administration, which in actuality it was not civil at all. It was a military rule of the West Bank and Gaza, and now they hired a new so-called civil administrator in the West Bank and another one in Gaza because they want to go back to the days of occupation as usual, with the hope of controlling the resistance while pushing the population out in anticipation of the final annexation. I reject the idea that, unfortunately, a lot of intelligent people continue to convey that idea that everything is happening in Gaza has everything to do with the fact that Netanyahu does not want to go to prison and he's just trying to keep his coalition alive. By bribing them here and there, Bing Veer, do whatever you want to Al-Aqsa Mosque, Smotrich, we will give you a few settlements in the West Bank and, just keep the war on Gaza going as long as possible until Netanyahu recovers his numbers and everything is going to be good and dandy. But of course, there's no truth to that whatsoever. Of course, Netanyahu has his own personal ambitions and concerns, but that doesn't concern us a great deal. When you see what is happening in the West Bank, this systematic stratagem to seize large swathes of the West Bank, to push Palestinians out in large numbers, and even beyond the West Bank, where they are talking about Lebanon, where they're talking about Syria, the Jordan, even, Smotrich is back talking about the greater Israel. This is not about Netanyahu and his government. This is about something else entirely, something much bigger and much more consequential. So it's important that we do not belittle the Israeli action and just confine it to that of the genocide in Gaza, and think of the genocide in Gaza as a smoke screen to something that is even bigger than that genocide, which is what Israel would think of as the final solution. I mean, remember, Netanyahu has said it, and he was honest about this when he said this is going to be the last war that Israel would fight. Now, this could be understood in two different ways: that we are going to exterminate the Palestinians, and that's what they are trying to do, and in the West Bank resistance, and move Palestinians out of much of the West Bank and maybe the whole of the West Bank, and of course destroy any other resistance that exists in the Arab world. Or could be understood from the Palestinian point of view that if we continue to resist this in all forms of resistance, and force Netanyahu to abandon his plans, therefore teach Israel that it has reached the limits of what its military power can achieve in terms of politics, it will also be the last. I want to be optimistic that this is indeed what we are doing and what we will continue to do. But it's so important in my mind that we start linking the issues beyond the cliches, the cliche political analysis of what's happening in Gaza. Because I think this is ultimately not just about Gaza, it's about the representation of Gaza. If emboldened, the resistance in Gaza celebrates some kind of victory in Gaza, the West Bank is going to rise against Israel's much greater and larger stratagem of total control of the West Bank, the annexation of the West Bank, and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people from the West Bank. Thanks so much for listening.